A few years ago, millions of Americans achieved what generations had been told was the ultimate financial milestone. They bought a home. Some locked in mortgage rates below 3%. Others finally moved into neighborhoods they had dreamed about for years. At the time, it felt like security. It felt like freedom. It felt like a reward for decades of work. But something strange has happened since then. Many of those same homeowners now find themselves staring at opportunities they can no longer afford to pursue. A better job in another state, a smaller home after retirement, a move closer to aging parents, a fresh start in a different city. On paper, they own one of the most valuable assets of their lives. In reality, many feel less mobile than they did when they were renters. The housing market is often discussed through prices, interest rates, and inventory. But beneath those headlines, a quieter shift is unfolding, one that has little to do with whether homes are going up or down in value. For millions of Americans, the cost of moving has become so high that staying put is no longer a preference. It is becoming an economic necessity, and that may be changing the country in ways that few people fully understand. Part 2, The Background. How homeowners became stuck. For much of modern American history, homeownership was closely tied to mobility. People bought starter homes, built equity, and eventually moved. A growing family might need more space. A new career opportunity could pull someone across state lines. Retirement often meant downsizing and relocating somewhere warmer or more affordable. The system was never perfect, but it generally allowed movement. A home was both a place to live and a stepping stone to the next chapter of life. Then came one of the most unusual periods in housing history. When interest rates collapsed during the pandemic, millions of Americans rushed into the market. Mortgage rates that once seemed impossible suddenly became reality. Borrowers secured loans at rates near 3%, and in some cases, even lower. For homeowners, it felt like winning a financial lottery. Monthly payments became manageable, even as home prices surged. The problem is that those mortgages did not merely reduce borrowing costs. They fundamentally changed future decisions. Imagine a homeowner who purchased a house in 2021 with a mortgage rate below 3%. A few years later, that same homeowner receives a job offer in another city. Under normal circumstances, moving might seem logical, but the financial math has changed dramatically. Selling the current home means giving up that exceptionally cheap mortgage. Buying another house could require accepting a mortgage rate that is twice as high, or more. Even if the new home costs roughly the same amount, the monthly payment could increase by hundreds or even thousands of dollars. Suddenly, a career opportunity becomes a financial penalty. What appears to be a personal decision is increasingly shaped by a structural incentive. Stay where you are. Do not move. Do not restart. The numbers reveal how widespread this phenomenon has become. In previous decades, existing homeowners moved far more frequently than they do today. Residential mobility rates across the United States have been trending downward for years, but the decline accelerated as mortgage rates surged after the pandemic-era buying frenzy. At the same time, housing affordability deteriorated. Home prices climbed, interest rates increased, property taxes rose in many regions. Insurance costs exploded in certain parts of the country. The result is a housing market where moving often requires accepting multiple financial burdens simultaneously. The mortgage is only one part of the equation. Insurance premiums have become a growing concern for homeowners. In states vulnerable to hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and severe weather events. In some regions, annual insurance costs have risen so quickly that they now resemble a second property tax. Meanwhile, local governments facing budget pressures have increasingly relied on property tax revenues to fund public services. For homeowners considering relocation, these costs cannot be ignored. A move that looks affordable at first glance often becomes much more expensive after accounting for insurance, taxes, maintenance, and financing costs. This creates a paradox. Many Americans have accumulated significant home equity over the past decade. On paper, they appear wealthier than ever. Yet wealth and flexibility are not always the same thing. A homeowner may possess hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity while simultaneously feeling unable to relocate. The asset has appreciated. The freedom associated with it has not. This is where the story becomes more complicated, because the consequences extend far beyond individual households. What begins as a housing issue gradually transforms into something larger, an economic force that influences labor markets, retirement decisions, family planning, and even the geographic future of entire communities. To understand how that happens, we need to step away from statistics and look at what this shift feels like from inside a single household. Part 3. The Case of David and Lisa. On paper, David and Lisa appear to be exactly the kind of homeowners policymakers often celebrate. They are both in their 50s. They have stable careers. They purchased their home in suburban North Carolina during the summer of 2021. Their mortgage rate is just under 3%. For years, everything seemed to be working according to plan. The house appreciated in value. Their monthly payment remained manageable. Their neighborhood was quiet. Financially, they felt secure. Then life changed. Not because of a recession, not because of a housing crash, simply because life rarely stands still. David received an opportunity to transfer to another office nearly 600 miles away. The position came with a higher salary and stronger long-term prospects. A decade earlier, the decision might have been easy. Families move for opportunities all the time. But when they began calculating the numbers, something unexpected happened. The promotion started looking less like an opportunity and more like a financial trap. Their current mortgage payment reflected a world that no longer existed, a world of ultra-low interest rates, a world that disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. If they sold their home and purchased a similar property in the new city, their monthly housing costs would rise dramatically. Not because the new home was more expensive, because the financing environment had changed. The same amount of debt now carried a completely different price. The difference was large enough to erase most of the income increase associated with the promotion. The family found themselves asking a question that millions of Americans are quietly asking. Is moving actually worth it anymore? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. People relocate all the time. Yet the more they examined the details, the more complicated the decision became. The new mortgage would be larger. Property taxes would be higher. Insurance costs would increase. Moving expenses alone would consume thousands of dollars. What initially appeared to be a career advancement started to resemble a long-term financial downgrade. David postponed the transfer. Then he postponed it again. Eventually, the opportunity disappeared. The decision was rational, at least financially. Yet something about it felt strange. A family that had spent decades building stability suddenly discovered that stability itself had become a barrier. What made the situation particularly frustrating was that they were not struggling. They were not behind on payments. They were not facing foreclosure. They were not living paycheck to paycheck. They were doing everything right. And still, they felt trapped. This feeling appears repeatedly across the country. A retired couple wants to downsize, but discovers that a smaller home would cost nearly as much as their current one, after financing and taxes are considered. A young family wants to move closer to grandparents, but cannot justify abandoning a mortgage rate they may never see again. A professional receives a job offer in another state, but realizes the raise will not compensate for the increased cost of housing. These stories often go unnoticed because they do not resemble traditional economic hardship. There are no dramatic headlines, no visible crisis, no sudden collapse. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of decisions that never happen, moves that never occur, jobs that are never accepted, communities that are never joined, life plans that remain permanently postponed. Economists sometimes describe housing as a mechanism that helps labor flow toward opportunity. When workers can relocate efficiently, businesses grow, regions develop, and the economy adapts. But what happens when millions of homeowners begin making decisions based not on where they want to live, but on what mortgage they cannot afford to leave behind? The answer may be far more significant than a few delayed relocations. Because once enough households begin making the same calculation, the effects start appearing far beyond individual living rooms. What looks like a personal housing decision gradually becomes a structural force, shaping the movement of an entire nation. Part 4. When a housing decision becomes a national economic force. At first, the lock-in effect appears to be a private problem. A homeowner decides not to move. A family postpones a relocation. A retiree delays downsizing. None of these choices seem large enough to influence the broader economy. But economic systems are often shaped by millions of small decisions occurring simultaneously. And that is where this story begins to expand. For generations, one of America's greatest economic advantages was mobility. Workers moved toward opportunity. Regions experiencing growth attracted talent. Industries could expand because people were willing to relocate. Mobility acted like a circulatory system. It allowed labor, skills, and economic activity to flow where they were needed most. When mobility slows, the effects spread far beyond housing. Consider what happens when a company struggles to fill specialized positions. In the past, candidates from other states might have accepted relocation offers. Today, many workers look at the housing math and decide to stay where they are. The issue is not necessarily the salary. The issue is the cost of replacing a low-rate mortgage. As a result, employers increasingly compete for a smaller pool of local workers. Hiring becomes more difficult. Expansion slows. Economic growth becomes less efficient. What appears to be a housing issue quietly transforms into a labor market issue. The consequences extend even further. Retirement patterns are beginning to change as well. For decades, many Americans viewed retirement as a transition. They would sell the family home, unlock accumulated equity, and move somewhere smaller, cheaper, or more suitable for aging. That transition is becoming more complicated. In some markets, downsizing no longer produces the financial benefits people expect. A smaller property may carry higher financing costs. Insurance premiums may offset potential savings. Property taxes may remain elevated. The result is that many retirees remain in larger homes longer than anticipated. Again, the decision is rational. Yet when millions make the same decision, housing inventory becomes constrained. Fewer homes enter the market. Fewer opportunities become available for younger buyers. A chain reaction begins to emerge. The housing market becomes less dynamic. The effects are particularly visible in regions experiencing rapid population growth. Cities that once attracted newcomers now face a strange contradiction. Jobs may be available. Businesses may be hiring. Demand may be strong. Yet, housing constraints make migration increasingly difficult. The traditional mechanism that connected opportunity with movement begins to weaken. This creates a feedback loop. Limited mobility reduces housing turnover. Reduced turnover restricts supply. Restricted supply supports higher prices. Higher prices further discourage movement. The cycle reinforces itself. Over time, a temporary market condition starts behaving like a structural feature. And there is another layer that receives far less attention: psychology. Economic systems are not driven solely by numbers. They are driven by expectations. Homeowners who secured historically low mortgage rates increasingly view those loans as assets in their own right. The mortgage becomes something valuable, something worth protecting, something that should not be surrendered lightly. This changes behavior. A homeowner may dislike a neighborhood. A family may outgrow a house. A worker may want to relocate. Yet, the thought of giving up a mortgage rate that may never return creates hesitation. The home becomes anchored not only by physical location, but by financial memory. Economists sometimes discuss opportunity cost. What is less frequently discussed is the emotional cost of abandoning a perceived advantage. People are often willing to tolerate inconvenience if the alternative feels like losing something valuable. In this case, what they fear losing is not the house itself. It is the financial conditions attached to it. And that subtle distinction matters, because it means many homeowners are not necessarily choosing where they want to live. They are choosing which financial sacrifice seems least painful. This is where the lock-in effect begins to resemble a hidden tax. Unlike a traditional tax, no government agency sends a bill. No line item appears on a statement. No payment is collected directly. Yet the economic consequences are real. The cost appears in opportunities declined, in moves postponed, in careers redirected, in retirement plans altered, in businesses struggling to recruit talent. In housing markets that become increasingly rigid, the burden is paid not with money alone, but with flexibility. And flexibility has always been one of the defining advantages of economic mobility. For decades, Americans often measured success through ownership. A house represented stability, a foundation, a symbol of progress. But what happens when the same asset that provides stability also reduces freedom? What happens when the reward for entering the housing market becomes the inability to leave it? Those questions lead to a deeper issue, one that extends beyond economics and into the way people experience their own lives. Part 5, the psychological cost of staying put. Economic stories are often told through charts. Interest rates rise, home prices increase, inventory falls. But most people do not experience the economy through data. They experience it through decisions. And increasingly, many homeowners are discovering that the hardest part of the lock-in effect is not financial. It is psychological. There is a subtle difference between choosing to stay somewhere and feeling unable to leave. From the outside, those situations may look identical. Inside a household, they feel completely different. When people believe they have options, stability feels comforting. When those options begin to disappear, stability can start feeling restrictive. This tension appears repeatedly in conversations with homeowners across the country. They may appreciate their homes. They may enjoy their communities. Yet many describe a lingering sense that major life decisions are being shaped by forces outside their control. The feeling is difficult to explain because there is no obvious crisis. No foreclosure notice arrives in the mail. No bank threatens repossession. No emergency forces immediate action. Instead, there is a growing awareness that every alternative seems financially worse, and that realization changes the way people think about the future. Psychologists often distinguish between security and freedom. Security provides protection from uncertainty. Freedom provides the ability to pursue change. Most people want both. Historically, homeownership promised both. Today, some homeowners feel they are being forced to choose. The irony is striking. The very financial decision that was supposed to create flexibility later in life can sometimes reduce it. A family delays moving closer to relatives. A professional turns down a promotion. A retiree postpones long-awaited plans. None of these choices appear dramatic in isolation. Yet over time, they accumulate. The consequences become personal. Life begins to organize itself around financial constraints rather than personal priorities. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this shift is how invisible it remains. Traditional economic downturns are easy to recognize. Factories close, unemployment rises, markets fall. The lock-in effect produces none of those obvious signals. Its impact is quieter. It appears in the paths people never take, the opportunities they never pursue, the lives they never fully test. This is why the phenomenon can persist for years without attracting widespread attention. The economy continues functioning. Homes remain occupied. Mortgage payments are made. Everything appears stable. Yet beneath that stability, mobility gradually erodes. And mobility has always been about more than housing. It is deeply connected to possibility, the ability to imagine a different future and act upon it. When enough people begin to lose that flexibility, the consequences extend beyond individual households. They begin reshaping how an entire society experiences opportunity itself, which raises a final question. If Americans spent generations viewing homeownership as a pathway toward freedom, what happens when that same pathway starts leading somewhere else? Part 6. A quiet shift in the meaning of homeownership. For most of the last century, the American housing story followed a familiar narrative. Work hard, buy a home, build equity, create options for the future. The house was never just a building. It represented possibility. The possibility of moving upward, moving forward, moving somewhere else if life demanded it. That story has not disappeared, but it may be changing. The challenge facing many homeowners today is not a collapse in home values or a sudden financial emergency. It is something far more subtle, a growing gap between owning an asset and maintaining flexibility. The lock-in effect reveals how economic incentives can quietly reshape behavior without anyone consciously intending it. No law requires people to stay put. No institution forces them to remain where they are. Yet, millions arrive at the same conclusion through simple financial calculations. Staying becomes easier than moving. And over time, easier becomes permanent. Perhaps that is why this shift feels so difficult to recognize. It does not announce itself through crisis. It arrives through hesitation, through postponed plans, through opportunities that seem just slightly too expensive to pursue. The result is a country where many homeowners are wealthier on paper than ever before, yet less mobile than previous generations. A country where stability remains valuable, but flexibility grows increasingly scarce. And maybe the most important question is not whether housing has become more expensive. It is whether homeownership is slowly changing from a tool that expands life's possibilities into one that quietly narrows them. Because when a society becomes less able to move, it may also become less able to adapt. And that transformation is only beginning to reveal itself.